观众朋友们，大家好，欢迎收看本周的 So Go Trade 对话华尔街。美国联邦储备局从11月3号以来宣布，继续对美国6000亿美元的国债进行收购。那么此举一出，可以说是美国国内疑云重重，而国际社会呢更是指责一片。很多人都认为，美国联邦储备局在动用传统的量性宽松的手段，印钞票来刺激美国经济的复苏。而国际社会呢，更是认为，随着美元的贬值，很可能会让尤其是发展中国家的经济受到很大的损害。那么，美国联邦储备局这次收购国债的行动，是不是传统意义上的量性宽松呢？又会不会在之后造成美国的通货膨胀呢？而发展中国家的经济是否会因为美国联邦储备局对国债的收购造成很大的影响呢？带着这些问题，我们在本周也就专访了 J.P. Morgan 的资深经济师 James Glassman 先生。
詹姆斯·格拉斯曼，美国知名经济学家，美国西北大学经济学博士，前美联储纽约联储分行官员，摩根大通银行董事经理、高级经济师，美国经济与政策问题研究所成员。
Very glad to have you here on our show. Talk about the Federal Reserve asset purchase. Well, in front of you, I don't dare to say quantitative easing anymore. I got the definition from Wikipedia about the QE. It says that the quantitative easing is a monetary policy used by some central banks to increase the supply of money by increasing the excess reserve of the banking system, generally through buying the central government-owned bond to stabilize or raise the price and thereby lower the long-term interest rate. So why do you think this round of Federal Reserve asset purchase is different from the traditional QE?
You know, the traditional QE that we learn in school, a central bank buys assets, they create the reserves, and those reserves are loaned out into the economy with the banking system's help. And those loans then become money. And so this is why economists refer to asset purchases by central banks eventually turn into the increased quantity of money, which is why it's called quantitative easing. What the Federal Reserve is doing now, though, is completely different, does not conform to our textbook. The central bank is buying assets to help bring long-term interest rates down. It pays for those assets by creating reserves, but those reserves are sitting idle at the Federal Reserve. All the banks have them. They're called excess reserves. If they're excess reserves, they're not being loaned out into the credit market, and therefore not creating money. And that's why when you look at the U.S. situation, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet has doubled. All those assets they bought. The monetary base, which is the reserves that the Fed creates, has increased by $1 trillion. The money supply in the U.S. is flat. And that's telling you that the assets the central bank is buying are not being monetized. They're really sitting idle at the Federal Reserve. And for those who worry that the actions of the Federal Reserve are creating inflation, you have to ask yourself, why is it the Federal Reserve doubled the balance sheet 2 years ago, November of 2008. And meanwhile, in the U.S., inflation trends have been coming down. So obviously, this is a different story than people imagine. And what they're failing to look at is the full mechanism that turns asset purchases into money. This is a very different story, and it's not turning into money, therefore it can't be inflationary. It can only be inflationary if the reserves the Fed creates get loaned out, help boost the economy, and that generates new money and inflation.
So you're telling me the money base has increased, but the money supply to the
yes.
reality economy has remained the same.
Exactly.
And the banks is not lending out all those excess
exactly.
reserves.
You know, in a way, it's very similar to the challenge the People's Bank of China faces. So when an importer or an exporter gets dollars, they swap them for yuan with the central bank. The central bank, People's Bank of China, in order to prevent those new yuan from turning into money, they increase the reserve requirement and they use other tools to quarantine the reserves that are created through this process. And so in a way it's very similar, different kind of a problem, but very similar. What's happening though, the Federal Reserve does not have to take action to create those excess reserves because the banks aren't lending them out, because loan demand is very weak and the banks are being very cautious. And the Federal Reserve has told people that should it appear that the reserves are going to be loaned out more aggressively, they would take action to prevent that from happening, just like the People's Bank of China is trying to absorb the reserves that are getting created through the swapping of dollars and yuan.
So the objective of Federal Reserve is only to drive the long-term treasury yield down and not to increase the money supply.
Absolutely.
I read your article and you would like to call this asset purchase as duration easing or expectation easing. Why is that?
Yeah, because really what the Federal Reserve is doing is they are removing long-term assets from the market, so long duration assets from the market. And if you look at the bank balance sheets, because assets of banks have gone up because of the excess reserves, the banks have to issue managed liabilities, commercial paper, Eurodollars. So if you look at the balance sheet of the banking system and the Federal Reserve altogether, what's happened is the Federal Reserve has ended up removing long-term assets, banks are issuing short-term assets, and so the action has lowered the duration of assets in the market, which helps to dampen long-term interest rates.
Well, the international community has been attacking Federal Reserve policy. I think mainly because the value of dollar has driven down quite a bit, and those countries, they all have a massive of foreign exchange reserve, and they need dollars to buy the dollar-denominated commodities.
I think the proper way to view what the Federal Reserve is doing, though, from the point of view of a developing economy, is that it's much better for them to have a healthy U.S. economy and a healthy European economy, because their development is being supported by access to consumer markets in the U.S. and in Europe. So it is far better if the U.S. economy is struggling or the central bank needs to take extra action to boost it. The benefit to the emerging economies will be far greater in the future than any modest adjustment in the dollar relative to their currencies. So, and in fact, anybody who is linked to China and the business model of China, probably because the Chinese currency is relatively stable to the dollar, is not putting many at a disadvantage. So I think from my point of view, if I were in a developing economy, I would view policy actions that the U.S. government takes to help boost the economy are far more favorable for the long-term prospects of developing world than a slightly lower dollar. And now, because of the European crisis, of course, the dollar is down.
Well, let's see, a lot of developing countries, especially China, has a lot of U.S. long-term treasuries. They hold a lot of this kind of U.S. government bonds.
Right.
And when the yields drive down by the Federal Reserve,
the prices go up.
The prices go up, yeah.
And they benefit.
Right.
Right. So the Chinese and other developing economies, because they are accumulating dollars as a result of the effort to develop their economies, they are benefiting from this process if the Federal Reserve is able to dampen long-term interest rates.
Okay, my last question is that the history tells us we never know we're in a bubble until the bubble bursts.
Right.
So do you think this Federal Reserve asset purchase can, by any means, create some sort of bubble, especially in the emerging markets?
You know, I'm very suspicious because history tells us also that most bubbles and inflated situations happen in the best of times. Now, the developing economies are growing very rapidly. There's a very promising outlook for the developing world. So it is true that when so many good things are happening, it's easy to make mistakes, and you see those kinds of things. But the actions the Federal Reserve is taking and what's going on in the U.S., most of our excesses and speculative events have happened in good years when the economy is fully employed and nobody can imagine anything going wrong. I've never seen a speculative bubble emerge in a difficult time because everybody is so cautious. And that's why the central bank and the policymakers are having to take more aggressive actions to counter the caution in the private sector.
Okay, thank you very much,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Glassman.
美国联邦储备局对美国6000亿长期国债的收购，主要是为了达到3个目的。第一个呢，是将银行的额外储备金增加，这样银行也就会更舒心地用自己当前现有的可支配资金进行更多的借贷。
第二个呢是把美国的长期债券的收益率下调，这样的话呢，很多投资人都会转向美国的短期债券，尤其是公司债中，这样经济体在经济复苏中所需要的短期融资需求就得到了一定的满足。第三点呢是很多投资人也都会转而投向股市，那么股市的上涨也就是代表这些投资人的虚拟财富增加，这对美国消费市场的活跃也是非常有利的。在了解了美国联邦储备局的目的和操作手法之后，我们也知道美国联邦储备局对美国国债的收购不可能造成中国的通货膨胀，因为美元下跌、大宗商品期货上涨造成的输入型通货膨胀，目前看来仅限于黄金、白银等贵重金属的层面。因为早在2009年底的时候，石油价格就已经冲上了80美元每桶的位置。解决中国目前的通货膨胀，更重要的还是要从我们自己的经济政策入手。好的，感谢您收看本周的 SoGo Trade 对话华尔街，我们下周再见。